what's up guys? So today I'm going to be doing a comparative analysis between Nietzsche and Dostoyevsky's Crime and Punishment. It's this book right here. I finished reading it a couple times. I'm going to be using this Nietzsche reader as the basis for his ideas. I'm specifically going to be focusing on the idea of guilt and redemption. Both Nietzsche and Dostoyevsky have similar things to say about it actually. I also wanted to thank Professor Robert Gay from Binghamton for clarifying this. Okay, so first I'm going to go into a brief overview of what Nietzsche thinks about the punishment system. On the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche argues that a creditor and a debtor relationship is historically precedent for how we interact. This is also how justice came to be. This is in page 411, and he argues that the creditors that are punishing people actually derive a sense of enjoyment and pleasure from the cruelty and violence. Our sense of morality makes us feel like this type of violence is justified. It's a way of excusing the way we feel about punishment. In the modern context, it does kind of make sense. A lot of our punishment system is not based on logically preventing the crime, but rather it's an exaggerated revenge almost. A lot of our prison sentences are extremely long. It doesn't necessarily prevent or deter further crime. Furthermore, things like the death penalty has also not been shown to necessarily prevent more crime. What this shows is that human beings have an inherent sense of enjoyment of violating. And this inherent sense allows us to annul our anger over unpaid debt. And eventually this could expand out and it could go into our psyche, and he's arguing that it becomes involved in a greater justice system with the government involved and the state involved. Historically, this leads to more inward moralization where we start feeling things like guilt, which is a form of self-punishment, self-torture that allows us to annul our historically significant creditor-debt relationship. And guilt in and of itself, admission of it at least, is a repayment of that debt. At least it feels like a repayment of that debt. Nietzsche goes even a step further, and he talks about how religious cults and even scientists are basically turned to a form of asceticism where they self-deny in order to feel like they have control over those emotions that are already naturally present. He's also arguing that horrifying things have been done in the name of having this domination over our natural senses. And this form of self-denial could involve a lot of cruelty. Things like horrifying sacrifices and forfeits. Sacrifice of the firstborn belong here. The most disgusting mutilation, for example, castration, and etc. Those are all things that are historically present in human behavior, despite what you would assume to be the natural goal of evolution and natural selection would be. This type of awareness that human beings have, the consciousness that evolves from our communicating with each other, leads to the creation of something called reason. Reason and reflection, he's arguing, just gives a sense of false dominance over these emotions. He thinks that this type of thinking is actually harmful. But I will say though, it seems that Dostoyevsky and Nietzsche are using those words a little bit differently. We could talk about that as we go along. When Raskolnikov is first introduced, the pawnbroker is almost immediately played off as an antagonist role. Her dialogue is blunt and belittling and rude. She says, "What do you want?" Page 4. And the third person narrator characterizes her as being diminutive, withered up, and malignant. This provokes the reader to feel a similar sense of righteousness as Raskolnikov. And this has the effect of showing the murder as being a display of pleasure and dominance rather than just a desperation for money. To further go along with this, when the murder scene is described, it's never emphasized as it's a horrendous act. Rather than that, he's just using the same descriptive paragraph as before. It's rather contrasted with analogies of youth and old, weak and strong, to show that this is an act of domination rather than just a desperate crime. Furthermore, there's almost zero sympathy provoked for the pawnbroker. Her body is described as starting out of their sockets. The brow and the whole face were drawn and contorted convulsively. In contrast, originally Raskolnikov is shown as having full possessions of his faculties, free from confusion or of dizziness. And this is then compared to the scene with the horse, where the man is beating his horse, almost drawing a parallel to Raskolnikov beating the pawnbroker. And this sets a precedent for his sense of superiority over the others. However, this doesn't last at all. The rest of the book, it actually shows Raskolnikov as having extreme delusions and incompetency, essentially. In this quote, he's almost immediately left paranoid. Then a strange idea entered his head that perhaps all his clothes were covered with blood, and that perhaps there were a great many stains, but he did not see them, did not notice them, because his perceptions were failing, were going to pieces. His reason was clouded. And proving Nietzsche's theory correct, the next part of the book has Raskolnikov actually using reason to try to avoid the admission of guilt. Instead, he spends the rest of the series talking about how much better he is, while the book itself, the author, Dostoyevsky shows him as struggling with everything from his work to balancing his family, his role as a friend, his role to pay the rent, his role as a protector for his sister. He seems to be failing at every one of these things while the narration of his voice itself keeps saying that he's the superior man. In one of the scenes, the doctor, Zosimov, I think it's his name, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, he says the fundamental causes is only something that Raskolnikov would know about, and the sickness that he eventually gets, which causes him to faint and need a massive treatment, doesn't have any medical reasons other than more of a moral problem that only Raskolnikov himself knows to be true. And this part of the book is really interesting because he starts to basically confess without actually meaning to. At least he makes himself suspicious without meaning to. Like he starts bringing up blood and the word madman in page 179. And knowing that there has been a murder, it kind of makes him look like the person that's been doing that. He even calls himself out of his mind and gives all his money to Sonia. In a sense, Dostoyevsky seems to argue that confession and redemption is something that almost naturally has to happen, even if your faculty of reason says that that's not the right way to do it. So I think Nietzsche would also argue that Raskolnikov's fate is pretty much sealed, that he has to confess and admit guilt because that's how we are wired to be, and human beings don't necessarily have that free will to escape that.